Namaste and welcome to the Bharat Varta podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. Today we have a familiar face joining us on the podcast, an old friend who we know and admire for his love of politics, policy, and poha. But a lot has happened since. Ashish Chandorkar is a counselor in India's permanent mission to the World Trade Organization. Ashish was formerly a consulting leader and is a prolific columnist, public policy commentator, and expert. And of course, a badge of honor is that he is a guest extraordinaire on Bharat Varta. So without further ado, welcome back, Ashish. We've missed you.
Thanks, Carrie. It's great to be back on Bharat Varta. I just had my poha, which is why the recording was good actually. So good start to the. I mean, it's like the repeating the old process, old Sundays all over again.
Awesome. So poha is in Switzerland as well.
Of course, you get poha. I mean, you don't get prepared poha.
Of course, yeah. Awesome. So, folks, on this podcast, we'll focus on the workings of the government, right? And now that we have someone on the inside, I mean, it should be especially interesting to hear from Ashish. Right. So, Ashish, let's begin with that. Actually, what are some of the big misconceptions that common folks like us have when it comes to the functioning of the government as such?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily characterize things as misconceptions, but just to kind of level set what I saw from inside, or what I mean, it's just been 2 months. Actually, to be fair, it's not that I've spent a lot of time, but I think the few things which stand out is that. It's a very complex system. The implications of what you do or you don't do, there are huge implications, right? In terms of how something may impact various parts of the country. And given how large India is, that impact can be fairly uneven regionally, or let's say by different stratas of society or different parts of the country. So it's a fairly complex system, much more complex than whatever you can appreciate from outside. I think even inside, people do have this realization that no one person can really fully appreciate the impact or the outcome of their decisions. So they have to be very careful, and they have to be very, let's say, very deliberate in terms of seeking inputs, taking time, and not hastening to a statement or a change. Also, you realize that the change, let's say, from a corporate kind of a setting, undoing something or reversing something is much more easier than what you would do in the government, right? What government does, obviously. That decision is supposed to stay there. You're not supposed to roll it back. You're supposed to continue with that policy or that intent for a period of time. When you talk about speed has to also be taken in the context of the operational difficulty. That unlike in corporate, where you can do something and then undo it 3 days later because you think that that's not going to work out, or maybe there were new considerations, new data flowing later. In government, that flexibility is slightly limited. May not be zero, but certainly it's not as high as what you would see in a corporate setting. Hence, people will always bias towards prudence and discretion rather than immediate reactions or immediate action on something. And I think that's I can appreciate that much more from inside the system than what you would typically do seeing things from outside.
Right.
And also, it's very important to have some kind. I think the relationship between the political backing and the system understanding. I mean, the system movement is very strong. Things happen much more easily when there is political backing because then some of these things get ironed out, right? So basically, if the political view is that okay, we will take the blame, or we will take we will sponsor a decision, or we will say that okay, fine, the credit as well. I mean, you can take the credit in the system, but the blame we will take if something goes wrong. If that is available, that comfort or that cushion is available, things become much more easy for the bureaucracy and for the system to kind of do bigger and better things. So I think that those are some of my preliminary observations.
So I want to stay on the corporate versus government comparisons, right? We have this trope of why can't the government be as effective, in driving productivity and efficiency and better, let's say, allocation of resources and optimizing everything in a way a corporate setting works, right? And, it is, of course, a very naive worldview, I would say, to have. But do you see that there is, can you just thread that a little bit and perhaps talk through some of those nuances?
Yeah, I think this view, Carrie, comes, I think, from two historical context. And I think this is something which people who have been active on Twitter probably might have gone through a few cycles of first sponsoring this view and then later realizing that this view doesn't really hold very accurately, at least in the Indian context. So one reason, of course, is that in US, which is where a lot of us grew up reading governance literature from the US, right? And when internet grew big, I think a lot of us essentially started reading about how policymaking used to happen in US. And there it's a revolving door policy. People come from the corporates into the government, go out very quickly. The considerations there are very skewed towards, let's say, decisioning with a corporate consideration in place in the governance system, right? So people think of everything in terms of what they would have done in their own previous lives in a corporate avatar, and then they compare that into what they are doing or not doing in the government. So that is one reason. The second reason, of course, is that the influence of, let's say, the financial services sector on the government decisions, economy being a major driver, economy in a formal sense being a major driver, not in the sense of what's happening in, let's say, everyday inflation or the prices of onions and vegetables, which is more important in India. In the West, what is more important is that the economy itself as a ideological pivot as a driver of politics, right? So you will always get characterized as a libertarian or a capitalist or a socialist or a communist, whatever the descriptor be. But I think those labels are far more stronger and far bigger drivers of policymaking in the West, which is what has influenced a lot of discourse in our media and social media, at least at the turn of the century when internet made the worlds come together. So now, I think applying this to the Indian context, firstly, actually, I don't think there's a lot of relationship between how corporates work and how governments work or should work. One reason, of course, the most obvious reason is that the corporates are working towards a fairly narrow objective of profit maximization. So whatever you do, whether you act in a hurry or you don't act in a hurry, or you do something just in time, or you prepare for an inventory, whatever the operational decisions are, essentially have a single-minded focus of profit maximization, either in short term or long term or both in some cases. It depends on the philosophy of the industry and the company concerned. So governments cannot always work in that sense, because short-term objectives are also important, long-term objectives are also important. You also have to be aware of the second and the third derivative consequences much more than what you would typically do in a corporate. Again, it's not that the appreciation is not there. I think there should be a difference between intent, spoken word, and the action, right? So in the government case, you typically talk with intent or the action. You don't speak a lot about what's going on and so on. In corporate, spoken words matter a lot. You can speak a lot and still don't do anything. You can pay lip service to a lot of things and still not be held accountable for it, right? So some of those differences in terms of how corporates think, and of course the other thing carries that in the case of corporates, you are accountable to let's say a set of stakeholders who are your shareholders. You can claim that you are accountable to the society at large and so on, but of course everyone knows that where the red lines are. Where profit objective or the shareholder interest objective maximization will take precedence over, let's say, a social cause or let's say doing something out of corporate social responsibility. I think those red lines are fairly well understood in most corporates. In the government, the stakeholders are, first of all, the entire country is a stakeholder, whether irrespective of your political structure or who votes for whom, etc. Every citizen is a stakeholder, and there are also considerations of international relations in certain sectors, in certain areas. You have to be cognizant of what's happening around you. So I think the base, let's say the formulation is very different, and hence the speed at which and as I said, accuracy in government, I think accuracy becomes an objective in itself. You don't want to keep doing undoing things multiple times, otherwise you'll be labeled as someone who's clueless, who doesn't understand what's there around you. So I think some of those changes are very obvious and very stark, and especially so in the Indian context. Finally, I would also add that the resources which are available are also not infinite. Governments also have their own constraint. People who are working in the system, it's not that they've got access to everything at the drop of a hat, or all data is immediately available. The constraints which are there in corporate are also the same in government, but the negative impact is huge for doing something wrong. So actually, it's a much bigger problem in that sense, where you have to struggle not struggle in the sense you have to make some conscious effort to get all the right data and all the right information wherever possible, and then act so that you're not seen as someone who has destroyed something good, or who have undone something good which was going on. So I think those considerations are very, very, very stark, and I would actually not draw a very obvious comparison between how corporates work versus how governments work.
Yeah, for sure. Aside from the operational complexities, which are perhaps infinitesimally far more complex compared to corporate or any other field. I would say when there is an element of social welfare, right? The sabka saath, sabka vikas, sabka vishwas, as the Prime Minister says. How do you take all of the billion and 1.4 billion people together on all of these schemes and initiatives and everything that you do? So it's not just about policy for policy's own sake. I mean, I think there's a lot more to it than itself, right? So I know we covered a fair bit of this on a premium episode of Bharat Varta earlier on the direction of policy making and how much of this is governed by public sentiment and a subset of that, how much of it is governed by whatever chatter happens on Twitter or Facebook or social media, right? Now, do you have like a different perspective to it? I mean, having seen some of the stuff over the last couple of months?
Yeah, see, public sentiment does play a role, Kerry. I think what is important here to realize is that public sentiment, say Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, a lot of these social media platforms are driven by, let's say, the need of self-validation or self-aggrandizement, where the actors are also saying something which they may not mean of times but they want, let's say, validation of others in terms, and validation on social media means numbers, metrics which are maximized in terms of views or plays or RTs or likes or whatever be the case on different platforms. Hence, not every suggestion is also being made in the spirit of the holistic question, whether it is practical, whether it is implementable, at what speed which is implementable, what is the speed of change which a system can absorb, some of these things, right? So I'll give you two very practical examples. Let's take GST and let's take IBC, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code Act rather now. The change which both of these bills, both of these laws brought about are humongous. GST especially, like how it changed the taxation system, the indirect taxation system was humongous. But at what speed can that change be accepted in the system? Let's say, and I think I have mentioned this in one of my previous articles somewhere, is that when a corporate, let's say, switches into an ERP system, let's say you had a legacy ERP and you're putting up a new ERP, and there are like 10,000 users globally, you may still take like a year to stabilize it, right? In terms of implement it, customize it, stabilize it, year and a half is not unheard of. I mean, in fact, it's a base case. Now, here is a quote-unquote taxation ERP, which is impacting every consumer, I mean, every citizen in the country, because every citizen is a consumer. And also, like, the number of registrations of businesses is very high, like 1 crore, for example, and they will have their own accountants and CAs and finance professionals all accessing the system at the same time. The scale of that, not just the technology, but the scale of the process is humongous in terms of the change. So how many tweaks or how many reforms can you bundle in that process? That's a very deliberate question you have to answer. You cannot leave it to a chance. Like in a corporate IT setting, let's say if you had 5 modules of ERP going live and they did not work, you could easily switch off one and say, okay, let's continue with 4, and we'll come back and do the 5th one in 3 months' time when things are more stable. In a national taxation system, it's not always feasible to do that, right? So, I mean, with those kind of complexities around, will a commentary in media or social media impact a decision like that? The answer is no. I mean, you cannot, beyond the point. Of course, there's a constructive suggestion about the process itself. You can always onboard it. But if you say that you should be completely driven by the chatter or the commentary, that's not possible. Sometimes you also have to take the hard decision, knowing that it is a hard call for which you will get let's say some criticism, but you have to do it because you understand that the system as a whole cannot react to a change of certain magnitude beyond a point, or things will collapse in its entirety. Same with bankruptcy code, right? So like things have evolved. How the definition of what the definition of bankruptcy is, who can bid for the companies, who can be excluded, what is the vehicle of bidding. All of these things have evolved over the last 5 years since the law has been live. I think these things, and again, I think even the critics of the laws will accept that these have become better over time, and things have stabilized. I mean, GST got a lot of criticism when it went live, and the criticism was largely for the implementation aspect, not so much for the concept of the concept itself. I think concept, the critics probably have accepted that it's a good concept. But if you see 4-5 years down the line, things have gone back to normal in several cases. So I think there's also an adjustment period, which a huge country, and India is a multi-speed economy, multi-speed country, right? Like different cities. In fact, I meet a lot of foreign delegates here in my job, and people who have lived in India in the past always remark that they find India a country of humongous contradictions. So some parts may look like Europe, some parts may not look like a very very poor place. So they also keep asking this question, saying how difficult it is to get things done in India when there's so much internal contradiction, and contradiction not because it's intended that way. It's just the nature of how the country has evolved and how we are growing. That the growth will tend to be uneven, unfortunately, until it kind of levels off across different parts of the country or different segments of the society. So I think that in that sense, the feedback is welcome, but I think the practicality and the implementability aspect cannot be dismissed, which is very easy to dismiss, say, on social media. I mean, if you write 3 tweets and something doesn't happen after a week, you can say that this has failed because my 3 suggestions were not onboarded. Right. But it's not that the 3 suggestions were not known or not accounted for. But of course, at every stage, the government cannot come and clarify that, I have not done this because of XYZ reason. There's an aggregate. You have to also assess things in aggregate. You cannot assess things at a line item level, saying only 83% of what I said has gone through. You have to look at the larger picture, saying, okay, a lot of what I intended or what I suggested has happened or not happened.
Yeah, as they say, amateurs talk about strategy and professionals talk about the logistics, right? And the sheer amount of political capital required to sort of engineer this change also is sometimes underrated, I feel, right? Can we talk a little more about your role specifically, right? At the World Trade Organization, how does it relate with other international organizations, and what is the significance of this role?
So, the role itself is actually not very well understood by, I think it's a bit of a bane of my life. When I was in consulting, my kids would ask, what do you do? And it's very difficult for a consultant to tell to anyone, what do you do, right? Like, if I say I give advice to people, then people would say, then why would anyone pay up for that, right? People are giving advice all the time to everyone else. So I think it's the same situation here. The role is not very well understood, at least in my own family, social circles. But the WTO, the World Trade Organization, has got missions from all countries, which represent their respective countries. Each mission has got multiple officers, and there's a role called counselor in every mission. So the idea of this role is that you track and work on specific aspects of multilateral trade negotiations. In my case, it's called the Non-Agricultural Market Access, or NAMA. All the policy discussions which happen in the multilateral forum with respect to the market access which India offers, or India wants to get, or India aspires to get in other countries. I think the negotiations which happen at a multilateral rule-making level, I think that is the area that I handle. There are other counselors who look at service aspects, the services trade or the agriculture trade. So there are 3 counselors in the Indian mission. Mostly all missions have got those roles. I stress the word multilateral because the role is not a bilateral role. So, for example, if there was a specific need to having a discussion, let's say with a country, for a given commodity or a given part of trade, that won't fall under my purview or anyone's purview in any other mission, not just Indian mission, but in general, that's how the multilateral talks are struck. So this is at a macro rule-making level, which applies collectively and not individually. Of course, if there are individual problems, for example, if let's say Indian traders or exporters are facing some issue in, let's say, a specific country, and it's a systemic issue. By issue, I don't mean an individual transaction going bad. By issue, I mean if there's a country which is barring, let's say, access to Indian exporters to their market in a systemic way, and that can be done through the use of, let's say, non-tariff barriers like technical barriers to trade, or in case of agriculture, sanitary measures, phytosanitary measures. It could be through delaying trade facilitating measures. There are several ways in which countries impose non-tariff barriers. But if it's being done in a systematic way, which is hurting Indian interests, that can be raised in a bilateral manner in some of the WTO forums. But in terms of negotiation for market access in a bilateral context, that's not really the job that any of the mission officials in the mission. So it's a little complex. The difference between bilateral and multilateral has to be understood clearly. But to a layman, it may be difficult, and I face this problem all the time, at least in my social circles, because people assume that everything to do with trade would be like my personal responsibility, which is not the case.
And since you interact with delegates from many other countries, right, I have to ask, what is the impression that you get when you talk to these folks, right? What do they think about India?
I think one thing, people who have lived in India, and there are quite a few, I've met a lot of people who have lived in India in the past. I think they're almost always positive. I've not heard people who have experienced the life in India, they also understand firsthand the difficulties. So even if they don't necessarily sympathize with our negotiation position on some topic, they know what our point of view is and where is it coming from. So I think there is a lot more, let's say, goodwill and sympathy for people who understand India. There is also a set of people who have not been to India, so they sometimes don't understand the complexity and the various issues that our society faces or our country faces. But they are generally open to listening. They in fact quite curious. I think one thing across the board is that everyone wants to hear more from India. They want to understand what our points of view are, why we say what we say. I think some of the stories around say vaccination, the speed of vaccination, a billion doses. I think some of that is like really eye-popping for people. I've heard people joke that maybe like there have been situations where people have remarked that in a city or in a country they took months to do 3, 4, 5 million vaccinations, and they were amazed to know that India has been able to manage 1 billion over a year. I mean, less than a year. So I think some the scale, the talk about digital payments is always. I mean, I've been writing about it also. I think I've written 2-3 articles in the last 4-5 months. But I mean, it's actually quite interesting because when you show, and I've shown people like I've actually shown the use of UPI sitting here, saying this is how you move money, and people are amazed that I show them by transferring to my own account or to my wife's account, and people are just amazed to know that this is it. I mean, it's done. I said, yeah, it's done. I mean, it takes like literally less than a minute, while in most countries, those kind of things take a while. So people are always amused to know that a lot of good things are happening, which is contrary to what their the base expectation would be for how India is generally perceived. So I think there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of curiosity, and the more you talk about what's happening, the more good parts that you communicate, people do appreciate that all the time. And there are a lot of questions also around like countries which have got specific interests like manufacturing or services trade. They of course have more specific questions around different sectors, part of the economy. So I think it's good to have that conversation and to educate people about what's happening back in India.
And staying on the perception question, right? How much of it is being built by media? Do we underestimate or overestimate the amount of impact that something like an Economist or a New York Times or Washington Post has on these folks? I mean, in terms of their understanding of what India is like.
Yeah, that's a great question, Kerry. I've also tried to grapple with that, and I also tried to explore that a little bit. My sense so far has been that, barring the COVID wave 2 stories, where I think those pictures which were put out in terms of burning, fires, and I think some of that, yes, I think that those questions do come up, but I have not seen a negative commentary otherwise. I think barring in that one limited context of the India's handling of wave 2. And I think, to be fair, people also see the vaccination story, although we may not appreciate it necessarily, but like when you tell them, and like I've shown Coven, for example, like one guy asked me saying, can you send me the link to Coven? I will send it back to the capital saying this is how India is tracking. While we are failing to track a few million, India is tracking a large number on our digital platform. So I think those stories are also there. I mean, people do appreciate the good part also, but yes, I mean, I think the wave 2 was of COVID was certainly one area which was seen in a very different negative light by a lot of people individually, and I'm guessing that that's because of the media commentary which they saw.
Right. And COVID changed everything in terms of geopolitics, international diplomacy, foreign trade, everything, right? We've spoken on multiple episodes before on these shifts that are happening at the global level. So, I mean, you are sitting at the intersection of this, like foreign trade and diplomacy and economy and everything, right? Can you give us some insight in terms of how some of these countries are coming together to deal with a post-COVID world?
Yeah, I think these actions are quite deliberate from all the countries, in the sense that they do have a fair cohesion around their foreign policy, trade, their domestic ambition in terms of what they want to do on industrialization, self-sufficiency front. Like what we call Atmanirbhar Bharat, I think equivalent of those initiatives are being run by many countries. They may not just call it that way, or they may not characterize it that deeply in terms of national symbolism, but I think that those processes are very much on. And I think most countries do realize that at the end of the day, while globalization has got its benefits, the ill effects or the downside should also be well understood. That when everything is globalized, then there could be certain issues in terms of, whenever a tail event strikes, a tail event like pandemic strikes, there could be certain negative consequences of, let's say, being reliant on something for some other country. So I think that is a theme which I see constantly. I think every country kind of says it directly or indirectly. Of course, even the actions are well known in many cases. Even the developed countries are talking about reindustrialization and bringing back manufacturing jobs. investing more in their own countries, protecting their industries from global vagaries. So I think some of these themes are not necessarily spoken about in the same language that we do, but it's a very common sentiment in the globe today, across the globe. Yes, I mean, pandemic has, of course, made people very wary around the consequences of these events, which I think maybe, of course, like the way the globalization started in early 90s. I mean, this wave of globalization rather started in 90s. There was almost an assumption that there cannot be anything which can be undone. I mean, it was like a one-way street, right? So all the assumptions which were modeled into business, into international travel, tourism, I think those assumptions were essentially one-way assumptions, saying none of this will ever get rolled back. So it's also a painful process for countries which are far too dependent on external markets or other countries. It's also a very painful process. So smaller countries do bear a brunt when, let's say, borders are closed. And I also hear stories like even on COVID, for example, I hear stories which, if that was to happen in India, God knows what the reaction would be, right? So like stories around how, I'm not going to name any country, but like someone told me that in their country, there's a government is discouraging travel by putting a 14-day mandatory quarantine after you come in, including anyone, including own citizens. And I think at one point there was a rule that if there were 4 family members, they had to book 4 different hotel rooms. Even the family members couldn't stay in the same. So essentially, the cost of travel was made so prohibitive that no one would actually travel internationally, right? So that was one way to kind of contain COVID. So yeah, I think governments around the world have taken what would typically be seen as bizarre decisions or difficult decisions in normal times to respond to the pandemic.
And COVID has also made India's role a lot more prominent in the world of geopolitics, right? I think Srimoy Talukdar mentioned on one of the episodes that we now have a seat at the table that's indisputable, right? And and multiple factors to this. One is the whole de-hyphenization of India and Pakistan, for instance, right? Or the Quad alliance that is happening, and plenty of other things around that, right? So do you see that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think people always understand that India is a large country. We have our own points of view, our own compulsions, our own policy positions, and I think that's well recognized. I think what COVID has done is, of course, that the stories of resilience at a scale, right, that can be talked about much more forcefully. And I said, like the vaccination story or the lead which we took on the IP waiver for vaccines in WTO. I think those discussions have been ongoing. I think some of those elements bring out the role more prominently. And I actually don't think anyone is begrudging. Again, it's probably driven by more by like what you read in media and social media. I think like the officials that I talk to, no one has said no to meeting me, right? I mean, it's not, no one is saying that, we want to ignore India. If you go and ask someone, they will always go and they'll always want to meet you and talk to you or want to understand your points of view. So in that sense, I've not seen anything negative in this. I mean, when you characterize it as pandemic has made things much more positive, I just want to be cautious in saying that I don't think things were that negative to start off in terms of how India's role was being perceived. Of course, specific actions have highlighted our strengths, and I think that's a good part. But I think people are generally quite open to engaging with us and understanding our points of view.
Okay, one question in general on the economy, right? I mean, multiple factors indicate that an economic recovery is in full swing, whether it's the GST collections or the export numbers, or even the amount of business that we did on Diwali, for example, right? I mean, 1.25 trillion rupees. Your thoughts on what things will look like going further for the next 1 or 2 years leading up to 2024?
I think the near-term economic parameters all look very strong. I guess you've been discussing this on Weekly as well with Nirav and Prasanna lately, and I had also done a couple of articles on this theme. The short-term indicators all look very strong. I think the pandemic offers an opportunity to make fundamental shifts in the way our own economy is configured, right? So through the production-linked incentives, we are trying to create much bigger manufacturing base in India. The exports have done very well, since March. Of course, there's a value versus volume expansion there. So the value is also increased, volume is also increased. So we need to ensure that volume keeps up even when the prices stabilize globally, right? So I think that consideration is there. I mean, I think I'm pretty optimistic about how things are. I'm generally optimistic, but especially in the last year or so, how things have panned out. A lot of the reforms are coming together in terms of the classic J curve, right? And in terms of pushing things, making things more formal, increasing the efficiency in the economy in general, the labor getting more formalized, infrastructure spending, the plans around the national monetization pipeline or the national infrastructure pipeline, the new the capex investments, which not just the central government but even the states are doing, right? So just today there was a story that 7 states have met their capex target for the last quarter, and they are being allowed to borrow more as per one of the announcements which were made as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package last year. So a lot of these things, reforms, the center state actions together, coordinated actions, they're all coming together, and I feel that I think the near term, and by near term I mean the next 2-3 years, the picture should be fairly positive and fairly bright. And also there's a chance to not just grow in a mathematical sense, but also reconfigure the parts of the economy where you can fill in some of the gaps which have been there, especially on the manufacturing and industrialization side.
All right. Since you've been away for quite some time, right, I hope you've been keeping up on some of the episodes that we're producing, right? So what are some of your favorites among the recent ones?
I think I've been quite intrigued by Velina's. Maybe we should call it Vishwavartan or rather Velina's episodes. I think they are quite interesting in terms of the geopolitics, and of course it is also the coincidence that it now concerns my work more personally. So it's always good to get different perspectives of how the more macro global picture is evolving, and it also gives me a lot of, let's say, good insights to talk to other diplomats when I meet them here in terms of sharing my view or forming my view, if not sharing, but at least forming a worldview of my own. The other part is, I usually used to read. In fact, you can see a bookshelf behind me which is completely empty because my books from India, my ship from India has not arrived. Whatever I had shipped here, which included books. So I'm actually quite reliant on YouTube at this stage to consume most of my content. So in that sense, yes, I've not just kept up with Bharat Varta, but practically a lot of other video content, because I don't have much more to read beyond the videos. So yes, I think great information, Carrie. And I think the weekly has also gone to an hour. So you need to budget more time on Sunday now.
Yeah,
it's not 30 minutes. You are doing an hour now almost. So
yeah, for sure. It's become a lot more lively and engaging. Right. And Ashish, this was a fantastic chat. It was great catching up with you, and hopefully we'll have you soon on another podcast, discussing some of the updates from your end. Right. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks, Gary. Great to be back.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Bharat Varta podcast. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We started Bharat Varta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you wish to offer us feedback, do reach out to us on social media. We are at Bharat Varta on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could also get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvarta.in. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.